Hello again. So heart rate is a really good way to sense check your power data if you train with power, and if you don't train with power, if you just train with heart rate, then it's also a really effective way of seeing how your training sessions are going and to make sure you're going on track, you're working at the right intensity. Your heart rate is a good measure of how your body's responding, and although there are other factors that influence your heart rate like hydration levels, temperature, level of fatigue, it's still a good measure, and it's much better than no measure of what's happening. So what can it do? Well, I've got a few notes here. So it's a good sense check against your training zones if you're using power-based training zones. It gives you an idea of whether they're set sensibly. You can check. It's a good way of checking the intensity of the interval session to see whether it's at the level of intensity that you're aiming for. For instance, if you want to be above your FTP and your heart rate doesn't go above your threshold heart rate, you're either extremely fatigued or you're not working hard enough. Your FTP is maybe not set correctly. If you're doing an interval session and you've got certain recoveries, how your heart rate responds after each effort gives you an idea of whether the duration of the recovery is reasonable. Obviously, a good indication is whether you can hit the target power or the target pace for the next interval, but also if you check your heart rate, see whether it's coming down nicely. If it comes down rapidly, you can see whether that's the sort of level of recovery you want. If you're only looking for partial recoveries, then you can look for whether your heart rate comes down to the sort of resting level repeatedly or whether it drifts up. If you're only looking for partial recoveries, you would expect the peak heart rate at the end of the interval and the recovery heart rate at the end of the recovery to be gradually drifting up, and then you might have a longer recovery between sets of efforts. But it shows you what's happening, and also you can see if the rate of recovery starts to slow down, you know that you may be pushing the limits of how many efforts you can do. And if the rate of recovery is still really good at the end of your set of efforts, it might be that you could have planned 2 or 3 more, or even just 1 more, and got a little bit more training effect. Heart rate drift is a phenomenon that your heart rate drifts up as you work at a constant intensity. So if you're riding at a certain power level for 30 minutes or more, your heart rate might drift up. It depends how hard it is. So for instance, I did a 3-hour ride the other day and kept the power the same. I did it on the turbo train in erg mode because I wanted to see what happened. And after about 2 hours and 50 minutes, it started to drift up, and I can show you that graph on the screen. And it's a good indicator of how tired you are. If you're very tired, then your heart rate won't go up very quickly, or it won't go up to higher levels. So if you're trying to do a hard ride, then you probably find that you not only do you struggle to do the ride, but your heart rate isn't going up quickly either. So that's a very good indication of whether you're properly rested, or you should take some rest if your heart rate's not going up quickly. So let's have a look at these on the screen here. So this session is an example of a good training session, 4 by 8 minutes, and this athlete got well above the target powers. And in actual fact, I had reduced the powers a bit, so these powers are comparable with the other example I'm going to show you, which was an example of a not such a good session. So if we look at the heart rate data for this training session, you can see that it's nicely level, it goes up quickly and then it stabilizes, which shows that it is at least at threshold or maybe even a little bit below. But the fact that it drifts up throughout the range of efforts so a bit higher at the end, 170 beats a minute compared to 165 beats a minute, and I know that this is around about threshold for this athlete. So if we looked at the power zones, if we look at the heart rate zones, you could see hopefully that the dotted line represents the heart rate threshold, and he's getting up to around about threshold, and that's really what we want. The point of the session is to work around about his threshold heart rate. If we look at the power zones, you can see that the power is around about the threshold power. So that tells us that the power threshold matches the heart rate threshold, and also it tells us that he's doing the session well, he's recovering between the efforts, and his heart rate's rising nicely, and he's handled the session really well. Whether he would have managed another one, I'm not sure, but that remains to be seen for his next interval session. So here you can see a similar interval session. This was a few weeks earlier, and he was starting to suffer from fatigue. He was getting tired, and he struggled to do this session. In fact, he didn't complete it. As you can see, the powers are below the target powers. And if we look at his heart rate data, and you can see that his first effort he did get up to the threshold heart rate, which was a bit higher actually than his first effort previously. But you can see that here his heart rate after the warm-up's gradually drifting down very slowly, and his recoveries aren't as fast as they were in the previous one, and the heart rate's drifting up rather than jumping up. And here, look, it doesn't even go up properly, and it's very slow to rise here, whereas you would expect it to go up quite quickly, and then for the effort maintain a nice level and then drop away. So what this showed me is that because his heart rate was going to threshold, and he should be able to sustain a threshold power for 3 by 8 minutes fairly comfortably, I realised that, and because he couldn't, the intensity of the session is reasonable, but he was just in a fatigue state because he couldn't do it. So it's a case of combining the fact that he hit the threshold heart rate but wasn't able to sustain it, and therefore he had a bit of a break, and you can see a few weeks later that he managed to hit the session and do 4 efforts at that intensity. So if you look at heart rate drift in this session, you can see that the power is very constant, and if you look at the power zones, it's a very low intensity. If you look at the power zones, you can see that they're pretty well fixed in training zone 2, and but if you look at heart rate zones, there's also just into zone 2, and so it might mean there's a slight mismatch between the power and the heart rate zones, because the heart rate was sort of towards the bottom of zone 2 and the power was in the middle of zone 2, and subsequently this athlete has had an increase in FTP from a FTP test. But what this is all about is showing the drift in heart rate, and as you can see, the power's fixed. I'll leave the zones on because that line at the bottom, at the top of zone 1, bottom of zone 2, is a good marker, and you can see that it's fairly constant along here until we start to get around about here, and then it starts to drift up, and then later, particularly after 2 hours and 55 minutes, the heart rate does drift, and you can see markedly that the athlete is starting to increase fatigue, and what you'd notice is if you carried on for 3.5 or 4 hours, then it would keep drifting up. So shows that you're stressing the system. If it had stayed constant for the whole of the ride, then you've got to say that the ride would be well within the capacity of the athlete and might not be leading to the improvement that you would hope. So what you would want to do is ride for 3 hours at a slightly higher intensity, so you're stressing the system a bit more, or ride for longer at the same intensity until you maybe sort of 3.5 hours. And what you're looking for really is to just push that out. If you're an endurance athlete, you want to increase the amount of time you can ride without incurring undue stress on your system. So that's it. It's really simple. It's easy to wear your heart rate monitor strap, and incidentally the chest straps are generally a lot more accurate than the wrist-based sensors, and so therefore I advise you to wear a chest strap if you can, and particularly if you're on a bike you probably want to look at a head unit rather than looking at a watch. And so it's a simple thing to do, but it makes a lot of sense to see how your body is responding to the workload that you're putting on it, applying to it. Your workload is measured by the power that you're outputting, and your internal response is measured by your heart rate, and you can pick up those 5 things. You can sense check your power training zones, check the intensity of the intervals that you're doing, whether they're hard enough to get you into the required training zones, And also, if you're fatigued, you probably won't be able to get into those zones, and the reason might be shown by your heart rate not going up very quickly. So that's a good indication that it's time to take a break. It may well be that the interval intensities are reasonable, but because you're tired you can't get into them, and that would be shown by your heart rate not going up to the above threshold sort of area that you would hope it would go through. You can check the recoveries between intervals. If you've got too short a recovery, your heart rate won't go down between intervals, and that in that case you just might be riding a tempo session when you want to do a threshold session, because you're not getting enough recovery to get into that higher training zone and stress your system in the way that you've planned to do so. Look at your heart rate drift to see whether you're adapted to ride for long periods of time at a given intensity, and also if you're well adapted, if you don't get any heart rate drift, it may well be that you need to push the duration of your long rides or increase the intensity of long rides to get your heart rate to drift a bit and show that you're stressing your system and making an impact. But bear in mind that if you're doing long rides at an endurance pace to build your endurance and improve your aerobic threshold, then you don't want to be going into the tempo training zone. It's better to push the duration of the ride, keep it in zone 2 or zone 1, and get your training effect by that way, and improve your fat burning in endurance training systems. I hope you found this useful and interesting, and if you have and you want to hear more, see more of these type of videos, then subscribe, click the bell as a reminder to see when I produce something else, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.